I never believed in territorial predators with human-level intelligence until I spent 6 months mapping unexplained disappearances across the Great Lakes region. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about wilderness safety. The missing persons cases that law enforcement attributes to getting lost or falling into ravines follow patterns. Precise, deliberate patterns that form boundaries around specific territories. And at the center of each territory, without exception, there are signs of something that does not belong in any wildlife biology textbook. The official numbers tell you that approximately 1,600 people go missing in national parks and forests every year. What they do not tell you is that 87% of those disappearances cluster in less than 4% of the total wilderness area. They do not tell you that search and rescue teams recover remains in only 32% of cases. And they certainly do not tell you that the cases where no trace is ever found follow geographic patterns that suggest controlled hunting zones maintained by intelligent territorial predators. Before you continue watching, make sure to subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. My background is in geographic information systems. I spent 15 years working with law enforcement agencies analyzing crime patterns and predicting where incidents were likely to occur. The work was technical, data-driven, and completely divorced from anything supernatural or paranormal. When a colleague asked me to look at missing persons data for national forests as a favor, I expected to find random distribution consistent with people getting lost in unfamiliar terrain. What I found instead were clusters so precise it looked like someone had drawn property lines on a map. The first pattern I noticed appeared in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Over a 20-year period, 43 people had vanished without trace from a corridor of state and federal land roughly 12 miles wide and 38 miles long. No bodies recovered, no equipment found, no evidence of foul play or animal attacks. Just people who walked into the woods and ceased to exist. When I overlaid the disappearance locations on a topographic map, they formed a border, not a random scatter, but a distinct boundary marking the edges of a defined territory. Inside this boundary, I found something else. Reports of unusual animal sightings that local authorities had dismissed or ignored. Large canine tracks that showed bipedal stride patterns. Vocalizations that wildlife experts could not match to known species. Scratch marks on trees at heights exceeding 8 feet. And testimony from witnesses who described seeing something that walked upright like a human, but had the head and body structure of a wolf. I expanded the analysis to include Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the northern parts of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. The pattern replicated itself across the entire region. Distinct territories ranging from 30 to 60 square miles. High concentrations of missing persons cases along the boundaries. And within each territory, consistent reports of the same type of creature. Something the old-timers in rural communities had names for, but never discussed with outsiders. DOGMAN, Beast of Bray Road, the Michigan DOGMAN. Different names for what appeared to be the same species. The territorial boundaries showed sophisticated understanding of landscape and human behavior. They followed natural barriers like rivers and reach lines, but also incorporated human infrastructure in strategic ways. A territory might extend to the edge of a state highway, but stop precisely at the pavement. Another might include a network of hiking trails, but exclude the parking areas where people congregated. The boundaries suggested these creatures understood human traffic patterns and deliberately selected zones where they could operate without constant human presence while maintaining access to areas where humans passed through regularly. I drove to Michigan to investigate one of the territories firsthand. The area centered on a state forest preserve north of Traverse City. Local hiking clubs avoided certain trails, despite the fact they provided access to scenic overlooks and pristine camping sites. When I asked why, people gave vague answers about bad feelings or the trails being poorly maintained. But the trails were not poorly maintained. They were in excellent condition. Something else kept people away. I spent 3 days hiking the boundary areas, documenting what I found. The territorial markers were subtle if you did not know what to look for. Trees with bark stripped away in vertical lines too high for deer and too deep for bears. Rocks stacked in cairn-like formations that served no obvious purpose. Areas where the forest floor had been cleared of debris in rough circles approximately 30 feet in diameter. And tracks. Hundreds of tracks preserved in soft mud near water sources. The prints showed canine features, but with proportions all wrong. Too large, too deep, with claw marks that suggested something walking on its toes rather than flat-footed like a bear. On the fourth day, I found the kill site. A deer carcass in an advanced state of decomposition, but the manner of death told the story. The spine had been severed cleanly behind the skull. The major muscle groups had been stripped away with precision, and the remains had been partially buried, not scattered by scavengers. This was not how natural predators feed. Mountain lions scatter remains. Wolves leave bones gnawed and broken. This carcass showed deliberate butchering and disposal, suggesting intelligence and planning. 20 yards from the kill site, I found human artifacts. A backpack partially concealed under fallen branches. The contents were intact. Water bottles, trail mix, a first aid kit, and a journal. The journal belonged to a hiker who had been reported missing 8 months earlier. The final entry described hearing something large moving parallel to the trail, and a decision to cut the hike short. There were no entries after that. The backpack had been placed, not dropped. Someone or something had taken it from the trail and deliberately hidden it away from where searchers would look. I reported the find to local authorities immediately. They recovered the backpack and searched the area for remains. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no additional evidence. The official conclusion was that the hiker had died of exposure and wildlife had scattered the remains. But exposure victims are usually found, and wildlife do not hide backpacks under brush 100 yards from the trail. I began collecting testimony from people who had encountered these territories firsthand and survived. The accounts shared disturbing similarities. Hikers who reported being followed for miles by something that stayed just out of sight. Campers who woke to find their tents surrounded by tracks. Hunters who abandoned blinds after hearing vocalizations that combined howling with what sounded like speech patterns. And in several cases, people who saw the creatures directly and lived only because they submitted to territorial authority by retreating immediately. One account came from a bow hunter who had been tracking elk through state forest land in northern Wisconsin. He was following a game trail when he noticed tracks joining his path from the side. Canine tracks, but massive. Bigger than any wolf he had ever seen. The tracks paralleled his route for half a mile before diverging back into the forest. He continued tracking the elk until he entered a clearing and found himself surrounded by territorial markers. Trees stripped of bark, rock cairns, and what looked like deliberately arranged bones, forming a rough circle around the clearing perimeter. The hunter turned to leave and found a dogman blocking his exit from the clearing. The creature stood approximately 7 feet tall on 2 legs. Its body was covered in dark gray fur. The head was distinctly canine with a pronounced snout and pointed ears that tracked his movement independently. But the eyes held intelligence that went beyond animal awareness. The creature made no sound. It simply stood there, watching him. The hunter slowly backed toward the opposite side of the clearing while keeping the creature in view. When he reached the tree line, the dogman took 3 deliberate steps forward and stopped. The message was unambiguous. Leave now and you can go. Stay or resist and the outcome will be different. The hunter left his hunting gear and hiked directly back to his vehicle. He has not hunted that area since and refuses to enter any state forest without multiple companions. What struck me about his account was not just the encounter itself, but the territorial boundary enforcement it represented. The dogman had allowed him to enter the territory, track game through it, and reach the core area before intervening. Only when the hunter reached a specific location did the creature reveal itself and deliver a warning. This suggested the territory had zones of different sensitivity, with the core areas being defended more aggressively than the boundaries. I began mapping the internal structure of these territories using witness accounts and disappearance locations. A pattern emerged. The boundaries where most sightings occurred formed an outer ring. Inside that, a buffer zone where encounters were rare but sign was abundant. And at the center, a core area where disappearances were most frequent and where witnesses reported the strongest sense of being unwelcome or watched. The structure resembled how intelligent social animals like wolves organize territory, but with a level of sophistication that suggested much higher cognitive function. The core areas shared common features: dense forest cover with limited sight lines, multiple water sources, natural cave formations or dense thickets suitable for denning, and limited human traffic despite being accessible via maintained trails. These were locations that would support a small pack of large predators while minimizing human contact. But they were also locations where a human who entered would be completely isolated from help and where the terrain would favor an ambush predator. The temporal patterns added another layer to the analysis. Disappearances spiked during specific times of year. Late spring, when people began hiking after winter, fall during hunting season, and summer weekends when inexperienced hikers ventured into wilderness areas. But there were also cycles within individual territories. Years with high disappearance rates, followed by years with almost none, as if the territories were being actively managed, with hunting pressure applied and then reduced to prevent drawing too much attention. I documented the locations where remains had been recovered in the rare cases where bodies were found. They clustered near territory boundaries, as if the creatures were disposing of evidence in ways that would be discovered and attributed to natural causes. A body found at the base of a cliff could be ruled accidental. Remains scattered by scavengers near a trail intersection could be attributed to a person who died of exposure and whose body was consumed by wildlife. The placement seemed deliberate, designed to provide explanations that did not involve predation. In several territories, I found evidence of what I can only describe as systematic elimination of human presence. Small hunting cabins abandoned after occupants reported being harassed by something that rattled walls and circled the building at night. Forest Service equipment repeatedly vandalized until maintenance crews refused to work in the area. Entire trail systems that fell into disuse after multiple incidents scared hikers away. The creatures were not just defending territory. They were actively pushing human activity out of areas they controlled. The intelligence required for this level of territorial management cannot be overstated. These creatures were tracking human movement patterns, identifying infrastructure, and executing long-term campaigns to reduce human presence. They were adapting their behavior based on human response, escalating when humans persisted and pulling back when humans retreated. This was not instinctive animal behavior. This was strategic thinking and problem-solving. I obtained historical data on land use in these territories going back 60 years. The pattern repeated across decades. An area would see normal levels of human activity until a cluster of strange incidents occurred. Disappearances, unexplained attacks on livestock, structures damaged in ways that suggested deliberate destruction rather than weather or wildlife. Then human activity would decline as people avoided the area. After several years of minimal human presence, activity would gradually increase until the cycle repeated. The boundaries themselves showed remarkable stability over time. A territory established in the 1970s based on historical disappearance data matched the boundaries I mapped using current cases. Some boundaries had shifted slightly to accommodate changes in human infrastructure, like new highways or housing developments. But the core areas remained constant across decades. These were not temporary hunting ranges. These were permanent territories maintained across multiple generations of creatures. I discovered communication patterns between territories. Accounts from people who heard vocalizations described calls that were answered from miles away. The responses came from adjacent territories, suggesting coordination or at least awareness between groups controlling neighboring areas. In one case, a researcher camping at the junction of 3 territories recorded vocalizations from all 3 zones occurring in sequence over 15 minutes, as if the creatures were checking in with neighbors. The implications for missing persons cases are stark. Law enforcement treats most wilderness disappearances as people who got lost, injured, or fell victim to natural hazards. They search along trails, near water sources, and in areas with difficult terrain. But if my analysis is correct, they are searching in the wrong places. The people who vanish are being taken from boundary zones into core areas where search efforts never penetrate. The remains are disposed of in ways that prevent recovery or are placed where they will be found and misinterpreted. I presented my findings to a Forest Service official who had spent 30 years managing wilderness areas. He listened to the evidence and looked at the maps for a long time before responding. He told me that rangers and wildlife officers had known about these patterns for decades. They called them hot zones or problem areas. Rangers advised new hires to avoid certain regions after dark. Trail crews refused assignments in specific locations, but officially, none of this existed. Acknowledging intelligent predators in national forests would create liability issues and public panic. Better to attribute disappearances to human error and natural hazards than admit there were things in the wilderness that hunted people. The question of pack structure became central to understanding how these territories functioned. Multiple witnesses described seeing more than one creature during encounters. A larger individual accompanied by smaller ones. Groups moving in coordinated patterns. Vocalizations that came from multiple directions simultaneously. This suggested social organizations similar to wolf packs, but potentially more complex given the level of territorial management being demonstrated. I found evidence of generational knowledge transmission. In one territory, a logging operation from the 1950s had been abandoned after workers reported being stalked by something that watched them from the tree line. 60 years later, hikers in the same area reported identical experiences. Something that had learned humans near that location posed a threat had passed that knowledge to descendants who continued enforcing the same boundary decades later. This was cultural transmission of information across generations. The territories showed evidence of resource management. Deer populations in core areas were higher than surrounding regions. Natural water sources showed signs of being maintained, with debris cleared and approaches kept open. The creatures were not just using these territories. They were actively managing them to ensure sustainable food sources and essential resources. This level of land stewardship required understanding of ecology that most humans lack. I documented 13 distinct territories across the Great Lakes region. Each showed the same patterns. Clear boundaries, internal zoning, high disappearance rates in core areas, and evidence of intelligent territorial defense. The total area under what I can only call DOGMAN control exceeded 8,000 square miles. That is 8,000 square miles of wilderness, where human safety depends on staying in areas these creatures permit and leaving immediately when signs suggest you have entered zones where you are not welcome. The expansion patterns concerned me most. Historical data showed these territories growing slowly over decades. A boundary that was 5 miles from a town in 1980 might be 3 miles away by 2010. The creatures were not retreating as human development expanded. They were maintaining their core areas and selectively yielding only the most contested boundary regions while defending everything else. As wilderness areas fragmented, the territories became islands of predator-controlled space in an increasingly human-dominated landscape. I attempted to predict where disappearances would occur based on territorial boundaries. Over 6 months, I identified 12 locations where the pattern suggested high risk. 9 of those locations had missing persons cases reported during that period. The predictions were not perfect, but they were far more accurate than random chance would explain. The territories were stable enough that understanding their boundaries allowed forecasting where incidents would cluster. The psychological impact on witnesses created another dataset. People who had close encounters in these territories reported lasting effects that went beyond normal fear response. Hypervigilance, sleep disturbance, avoidance of wilderness areas, and persistent sensation of being watched. These symptoms matched PTSD, but with a specific trigger related to understanding they had been assessed by an intelligent predator and found either acceptable to release or too risky to pursue. Their survival had depended on decisions made by something that viewed them as prey. I interviewed a woman who had been hiking alone in northern Minnesota when she realized she was being followed. She heard movement in the brush paralleling the trail. She stopped, and the movement stopped. She walked faster and heard increased pace matching hers. She tried calling out, thinking it might be another hiker. A low vocalization answered, not words but complex sound that conveyed awareness and intention. She ran. The sound of pursuit followed for perhaps 50 yards and stopped completely. When she looked back, nothing was visible. But in the soft trail dirt, she found tracks. Massive canine prints showing bipedal stride. The creature had followed her to the territory boundary and stopped. Once she crossed that invisible line, pursuit ended. That account illustrated the enforcement mechanism. The territories had rules. Enter the buffer zones and you might be monitored. Enter the core areas and you might be challenged. Violate specific boundaries or behave in threatening ways, and you might be pursued or eliminated. But in most cases, the creatures gave warnings and opportunities to retreat. They did not want conflict. They wanted compliance with territorial boundaries that humans did not know existed. The warning systems varied by territory. Some used vocalizations, long sustained howls that carried for miles, signaling presence and territory claim. Others used visual markers that became more prominent as you approached core areas. Trees with fresh bark stripping, rock formations that appeared deliberately arranged. In one territory, hikers reported finding small piles of bones placed prominently on trail intersections, as if marking boundaries in ways humans would notice and interpret as warnings. I created detailed maps of each territory, including known boundaries, reported sighting locations, disappearance sites, and areas where witness accounts suggested core zones. The maps showed sophisticated use of terrain. Boundaries followed natural features that would be difficult to cross undetected. Core areas occupied positions with excellent sight lines and multiple escape routes. The creatures had selected territories that provided maximum defensive advantage while ensuring they could monitor and respond to human incursion. The seasonal patterns revealed hunting strategies. Spring disappearances clustered around trailheads where people accessed wilderness after winter. The creatures were targeting the first wave of hikers when human scent was still novel after months of minimal traffic. Fall incidents occurred deeper in territories where hunters pursuing game ventured into areas normally avoided. Summer cases showed different patterns, with victims often being solo hikers or small groups that could be isolated without witnesses. I found correlations between moon phases and disappearance rates. New moon periods showed elevated incidence, suggesting the creatures preferred operating in darkness where their advantages were greatest. But there were also daytime disappearances, which meant these predators could operate whenever opportunity presented rather than being restricted to nocturnal hunting like most predators. The weather data showed another pattern. Disappearances spiked during overcast conditions when aerial search and rescue would be hampered. Rain and snow increased incident rates, possibly because the creatures knew their tracks would be washed away and scent trails eliminated. They were not just opportunistic hunters. They were planning their activities around conditions that reduced the chance of their presence being documented. I documented cases where the creatures had moved human remains after death, bodies found miles from where the person was last seen, remains located in positions that suggested they had been transported and placed rather than falling or crawling to the location. This post-mortem handling served two purposes. It confused search efforts by separating the victim from the attack site, and it allowed placement of remains where discovery would lead to conclusions that did not involve predation. The equipment left at disappearance sites told stories. Backpacks still loaded with gear that would have been useful for survival. Clothing folded or arranged rather than scattered. Water bottles emptied and placed upright. In several cases, personal items like wallets or phones were found grouped together as if someone had gone through pockets and removed everything before disposal. This was not scavenging behavior. This was deliberate processing of remains. I attempted to estimate population sizes for each territory. Based on food requirements for large predators and sustainable prey populations in the territories, the numbers suggested small packs of perhaps 5 to 10 individuals per territory. This aligned with witness accounts that described seeing multiple creatures, but never large groups. The pack sizes were large enough to maintain territory and hunt effectively, but small enough to avoid depleting resources. The question of human meat as a food source was unavoidable. The math did not support humans being primary prey. There simply were not enough victims to sustain populations of large predators. More likely, humans were territorial threats that needed to be eliminated rather than food sources. The creatures hunted deer, elk, and other wildlife for sustenance. They removed humans who violated territorial boundaries or posed risks to the pack. This made them more dangerous, not less. It meant they killed humans for reasons beyond hunger. I found accounts of territorial disputes between dogman packs. Areas where two territories met showed elevated sign activity. More vocalizations, more frequent marking, and sometimes evidence of violence. In one location, a hiker had photographed what appeared to be blood spatter on trees along a ridge that formed a boundary between territories. Analysis suggested the blood was canine, but from an animal much larger than known wolf populations. The territories were not just defended against human intrusion. They were defended against other dogman groups as well. The most disturbing pattern involved repeat disappearances at specific locations. Certain trail sections, campsites, or hunting blinds showed multiple incidents spanning decades. The same bend in a trail where 3 people vanished over 30 years. The same camping area where 4 separate groups reported being harassed before one person from each group disappeared. These were not random encounter points. These were deliberate kill zones that the creatures returned to because the terrain provided advantages. I mapped these high-risk locations and found they shared common features. Limited visibility, difficult terrain that slowed human movement, and positions where someone could be isolated from the main trail without being noticed. The creatures had identified locations where humans were most vulnerable and were using them systematically. This was not ambush predation driven by opportunity. This was premeditated use of terrain advantages built into territorial control strategy. The survival rate for people who encountered these creatures depended on how they responded. Those who submitted by retreating immediately had high survival rates. Those who challenged or pursued had low survival rates. Those who tried to document encounters with cameras or attempted to get closer for better views often disappeared. The creatures seemed to tolerate observation from distance, but interpreted approach or persistence as threats that required elimination. I interviewed search and rescue personnel who had worked in these territories. Off the record, they acknowledged areas they avoided during searches. Regions where teams refused to work after dark. Locations where K9 units behaved in ways that suggested extreme distress. One handler told me his dogs would not enter certain areas regardless of training or commands. The animals knew something was wrong in those zones, even when handlers could not detect any obvious threats. The financial cost of these disappearances exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars. Search operations, victim compensation, lost tourism revenue, and reduced property values in areas with high incident rates. Communities near high-risk territories experienced economic decline as people avoided outdoor recreation in those regions. The creatures were not just killing people. They were impacting human activity and economy across entire regions. I created risk assessment protocols for hiking in these areas. Stay on marked trails. Avoid solo travel. Never enter dense forest at dusk or dawn. Pay attention to warning signs like sudden silence or wildlife fleeing. Most importantly, if you hear vocalizations that do not match known wildlife or see tracks that seem wrong, leave immediately. Do not investigate. Do not try to document what you encountered. Leave the area by the most direct route and do not return. The protocols were based on analysis of survival outcomes. Every person who ignored warnings and continued deeper into territories either disappeared or had close encounters that left lasting psychological damage. Every person who recognized something was wrong and retreated immediately survived without incident. The difference between life and death was recognizing you had entered controlled territory and respecting the boundaries being enforced. I approached federal agencies with my findings. The response was consistent across organizations. They thanked me for the data, acknowledged the patterns were interesting, and explained that they could not act on information that suggested the existence of unrecognized species. To acknowledge these territories would require admitting that large predators unknown to science were operating in public lands. The liability implications made such admission impossible. Better to continue attributing disappearances to human error than open the door to lawsuits and public panic. I released the maps online with warnings about high-risk areas. The response split between people who thought I was creating useful safety information and people who thought I was spreading paranoia about fictitious creatures. Hiking forums banned discussion of the maps as fear-mongering. Conservation groups worried the maps would damage wilderness tourism. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that large areas of public land might be under the control of intelligent predators. Within 6 months, 3 of the territories I had mapped experienced high-profile disappearances. In each case, the victim was last seen at locations I had marked as high risk. Search efforts followed the patterns I had predicted, focusing on areas away from core zones where remains would never be found. The maps had been accurate, but nobody in authority would acknowledge them, because doing so meant acknowledging the premise they were built on. I stopped updating the maps publicly and shifted to private consultations with people planning trips into high-risk areas. I provided the data without interpretation, letting them draw their own conclusions about whether to modify their plans. Some thanked me and adjusted their routes. Others ignored the information entirely. Several who ignored the warnings later reported encounters that matched the patterns I had documented. None of those who modified their plans based on the maps experienced incidents. The cross-referencing with historical records revealed additional insights. I obtained access to archives from local newspapers going back to the 1920s. Reports from that era described logging camps abandoned after workers refused to return following encounters with what they called devil dogs or forest wolves that walked like men. The descriptions matched modern DOGMAN sightings almost exactly. These territories had existed for at least a century, probably longer. I found correspondence between forest rangers from the 1950s discussing areas they referred to as no-go zones. The letters were matter-of-fact, treating the existence of dangerous territories as accepted reality rather than speculation. Rangers warned colleagues about specific ridges, valleys, and forest sections where personnel had disappeared or experienced encounters. The institutional knowledge existed within the Forest Service, but it was never codified into official policy or shared with the public. I interviewed retired rangers who had worked in these territories during the 1960s and 1970s. They confirmed that experienced personnel knew which areas to avoid. New rangers were given unofficial guidance about where not to camp alone and which trails to stay on after dark. But this knowledge was transmitted verbally, never written down, and always presented as precautionary rather than based on specific threats. The unofficial system protected personnel while maintaining official deniability about what was being protected against. I obtained records of search and rescue operations going back 40 years. The patterns in where searches were conducted versus where they were not conducted told a story. Core areas of territories received minimal search effort even when missing persons cases pointed to those locations. Search commanders consistently directed resources toward peripheral zones and areas outside territory boundaries. The official explanations cited terrain difficulty or low probability of the victim traveling that far, but the consistency suggested something else. Search planners knew where not to send teams. I found incident reports from law enforcement that described unusual evidence found at missing person scenes. Tracks that did not match known wildlife. Signs of struggle in locations far from where the victim was last seen. Personal effects arranged in patterns that suggested they had been sorted through rather than scattered by animals. These details were noted in reports, but never investigated further. The cases were closed as deaths due to misadventure or exposure. The unusual evidence was documented but never explained. I discovered medical examiner reports from cases where remains were recovered. Several described injuries inconsistent with known predators or accidents. Skeletal trauma showing bite patterns too large for wolves or bears. Claw marks on bones that suggested something with greater strength and precision than native wildlife. The examiners noted these anomalies, but conclusions always defaulted to known animals or natural causes. Nobody wanted to state officially that something unknown had killed these people. I analyzed satellite imagery of the territories over time. The vegetation patterns showed interesting details. Core areas maintained dense canopy cover, even as surrounding forests were logged or cleared. Fire breaks and forest management operations stopped at precise boundaries that matched the territory lines I had mapped. The Forest Service had been managing these lands in ways that preserved the territories, whether intentionally or because field personnel refused to work in those zones. I obtained wildlife camera footage from hunters and researchers who had placed cameras in these territories. The cameras captured interesting sequences. Deer herds moving through areas, but showing extreme alertness, heads up, constantly scanning. Predator species like coyotes and foxes avoiding certain locations entirely. And in several cases, large shapes moving at the edges of camera range, too distant for clear identification, but showing movement patterns that suggested something walking on two legs rather than four. I interviewed wildlife biologists who had conducted population studies in these regions. They described anomalies in prey species distribution. Areas that should have supported normal deer populations based on habitat quality showed much lower numbers. But adjacent areas outside the territory boundaries had higher than expected populations, as if prey species were being pushed out of certain zones or avoiding them voluntarily. The biologists attributed this to predator pressure, but predator populations did not account for the pattern. Something else was controlling prey distribution. I found records of livestock depredation near territory boundaries. Farmers and ranchers reported cattle and sheep killed in ways that did not match typical predator behavior. Animals killed by single blows to the head or neck. Carcasses partially consumed, but not in patterns consistent with wolves, bears, or mountain lions. And incidents that stopped when farmers abandoned pastures adjacent to territories, but continued when new owners tried using those same pastures years later. The creatures remembered which areas they controlled and enforced those boundaries even after years of no human presence. I documented cases where hunting blinds and tree stands had been destroyed or damaged in core territory areas. The destruction showed patterns. Stands located in buffer zones were sometimes damaged, but usually left intact. Stands in core areas were systematically destroyed, often torn apart with force that exceeded what a bear could accomplish. Hunters who rebuilt in the same locations found their new stands destroyed within days. The message was clear. Permanent human structures were not tolerated in core zones. I analyzed acoustic recordings from researchers who had been studying owl populations in these forests. The recordings captured vocalizations that did not match any cataloged species. Long, modulated howls that incorporated what sounded like articulation or speech-like patterns. The vocalizations occurred primarily at night and often preceded periods where other wildlife sounds ceased entirely. Whatever was making those sounds commanded respect from native wildlife. I created temporal maps showing how territories had expanded or contracted over decades. The changes were subtle but consistent. Territories grew into areas where human activity declined. They contracted slightly where human development intensified. But the creatures never abandoned core areas regardless of pressure. They adjusted their boundaries to human activity while maintaining control of essential zones. This was sophisticated territorial management that required multi-generational planning and knowledge transfer. I found accounts from Native American communities whose traditional lands included these territories. The tribal elders spoke of beings they had coexisted with for centuries. They had names for these creatures and protocols for avoiding conflict with them. The protocols matched survival strategies I had derived from analyzing modern encounters. Stay out of certain areas. Travel in groups. Do not pursue or challenge if you see one. Leave offerings at boundary markers during certain seasons. The indigenous knowledge systems had solved problems that modern society refused to acknowledge existed. I interviewed hunters who specialized in tracking predators. They described finding tracks and sign that they could not explain using conventional wildlife knowledge. Prints showing bipedal gait, but canine features. Scratch marks at heights that suggested something much larger than wolves or bears. And tracking patterns that indicated intelligent hunting strategies rather than instinctive predator behavior. These experienced trackers knew they were dealing with something outside normal wildlife biology, but had no framework for reporting it officially. I documented the seasonal migration patterns within territories. Witnesses reported seeing creatures moving between different parts of their range based on time of year. Summer sightings clustered in higher elevations with access to water. Fall sightings moved to lower elevations near game migration routes. Winter sign indicated concentration in areas with good denning sites and proximity to wintering deer populations. The creatures were not randomly roaming. They were managing their territories to optimize access to resources throughout the year. The territories continue to exist. The patterns continue to replicate. Every year, new disappearances cluster in the areas I mapped. Every year, search efforts fail to find remains in core zones. And every year, the official explanation remains the same. People got lost, fell, suffered medical emergencies, or encountered natural hazards. The possibility that they entered territories controlled by intelligent predators and violated boundaries they did not know existed is never considered. The future trajectory concerns me deeply. As wilderness areas shrink and human development expands, these territories are becoming increasingly compressed. The creatures are being forced to defend smaller areas more aggressively. The buffer zones that once provided gradual warnings are disappearing, meaning people transition from safe areas to core zones with less opportunity to recognize and retreat. The incident rate will increase as territories become more densely packed and creatures become less tolerant of human presence. I have reached the limits of what can be accomplished through data analysis and mapping. The territories are documented. The patterns are clear. The evidence exists for anyone willing to look at it without bias toward conventional wildlife biology. What happens next depends on whether authorities are willing to acknowledge these territories exist and develop policies to manage human interaction with them. I am not optimistic this will happen. The institutional resistance to admitting unknown predators control public lands is too strong. I share this information because people deserve to know what they are walking into when they enter wilderness areas in the Great Lakes region. The maps exist. The risk assessment protocols exist. The survival strategies are documented. Whether you choose to believe the premise underlying this data is your decision. But the patterns are real. The territories are real. And the cost of ignoring them is measured in lives lost and families destroyed by disappearances that will never be explained. I no longer enter these territories. The risks outweigh any knowledge that might be gained. I have seen the boundaries. I have documented the warning signs. I have mapped the core areas. That is sufficient. I encourage anyone reading this to exercise similar caution. The wilderness contains more than we acknowledge. Some of it maintains boundaries we cannot see. And violating those boundaries carries consequences that search and rescue will never find. The territories persist. The disappearances continue. And somewhere in the forests of the Great Lakes region, intelligent predators maintain control over lands we think belong to us. They have been there longer than our trails and campgrounds. They will be there long after we abandon the areas we cannot safely hold. The question is not whether these territories exist. The question is whether we are wise enough to recognize them and adjust our behavior accordingly. So far, the answer appears to be no. And that is why hikers keep disappearing in patterns that form territorial boundaries around creatures we refuse to acknowledge.